Okay, everyone, thank you for joining us here today for the University of Texas Energy Symposium, October 31st, 2023. Today we have Emily Gruber. Before I introduce her more formally, I will point out the next upcoming two talks for our Energy Symposium series. Next week, we'll have Steve Keen, an economist. He will talk to us about the energy blindness of economics from Adam Smith to William Nordhaus. So if you want to think about macroeconomics and how economists think about energy and quantifying climate damages, then this is your talk. The following week after that, November 14th, we'll have Dan Earhart, CEO of Arcus Power, and he will talk about AI, artificial intelligence, and short-term power trading, a look at potential impacts on industry, economy, and regulation. So that talk will be about monitoring electric grid data and scheduling assets on the electric grid. But today, it's my pleasure to have Emily Gruber. She is associate professor at the University of Notre Dame, and she is associate professor of sustainable energy policy, as well as having an appointment concurrently with the Civil and Environmental Engineering and Earth Sciences Department at Notre Dame. Her research focuses on justice-oriented, deep decarbonization and decision support tools related to large infrastructure systems, with an emphasis on evaluation of dynamic, life cycle, socio-environmental impacts and the effects of different value systems on decision pathways. She has a PhD in environment and resources from Stanford, 2 master's degrees from here at the University of Texas at Austin, and environmental and water resources and energy and earth resources. So good to have Emily back speaking virtually on our campus. And her abstract for her talk today is Decarbonizing US Electricity by 2035. Only strands an estimated 15% of capacity years. So we'll learn about this, based upon typical fuel and technology-specific lifespans for fossil-fired generators that we're operating as of 2018. Setting explicit deadlines for closures can facilitate a just transition for workers and host communities by enabling advanced planning for the next steps. The fact that generators already exist presents a major advantage in that we know where they are. Policy can thus define when closures will occur, enabling more explicit and community-grounded planning to avoid major disruptions from deindustrialization and the coal transition, and in historical events like the collapse of the iron and steel industry. So without further ado, I will now pass it over to Emily and let her start sharing her screen and discussing her presentation. And as always, please enter your questions into the question and answer or Q&A feature of Zoom. And I will attempt to interject questions to Emily as we go. Otherwise, I will help ask them at the end of the talk. So Emily, I see your screen well, and virtual floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Gary. And yeah, happy Halloween to everybody. It's always a little fun to be in UT colors on Halloween, but really appreciate you hosting me today. And it's always a pleasure to get to talk to the UT folks. So yeah, greetings from Indiana. It's actually snowing behind me, but I'm here to talk a little bit about a couple of different things associated with fossil phase out and the just energy transition. I think I'm going to start out by talking a bit about what fossil phase out looks like, especially in the electricity sector, and then kind of transition to talking about some of the other things that we can do, and particularly related to kind of a simultaneous mitigation and adaptation strategy through deep building efficiency associated in particular with winter heating. So figured that this would be a good start of the year to do it. And it sounds like it's cold in Austin too. So we'll get ready and go with that. So just to kind of start out with a couple of the ways that I think about a lot of this, and just to kind of establish some terms that I'll use a bit. There's a lot of different ways you can think about decarbonization, but in particular, the way that I want to present it, and this is maybe a very civil engineer's perspective on this, is that decarbonization is 2 big processes, 2 big things. Industrialization, where you're building out a whole bunch of stuff that is intended to operate with 0 carbon emissions, and deindustrialization, where you're closing stuff that does have emissions. In general, from kind of a policy perspective and in a lot of other settings, we talk a lot about the benefits of industrialization. It's talking about new industries that are accruing to various countries or various locations, new jobs, new economic opportunities, these kinds of things, and a lot of the nice attributes that come from these newer facilities. We also talk a lot about the benefits of decarbonization, so generally focused on climate change, but also increasingly recognizing a lot of the co-benefits that we tend to see when we start moving away from combustion-based carbon-bearing fuels. So thinking not just about actually slowing climate change, but also things like air pollution, water use, those types of things. So this comes up a lot also in policy contexts. What we don't talk about as much, and what I will talk about today a little bit, is stuff like the disbenefits of industrialization. So in particular, as we really start to take something like a net zero emissions target seriously, it's a little shocking sometimes to realize how much infrastructure we actually need. So in the US, for example, and I'll talk about this a bit later in the talk, we're maybe looking at increasing the size of our electricity system by a factor of 5 to 8. And that's a big deal. And there's a lot that goes into that. So land use changes, proximity to new infrastructure, those types of things. We don't usually talk about deindustrialization at all, which is, I think, also something that has historically been seen as a little bit politically toxic, but thinking about what it actually means to close down the things that are causing emissions, that's not something that comes up a bunch, but it's absolutely critical when we actually think about succeeding at decarbonization. You can't just add a bunch of zero carbon stuff and not also take away the carbon-based stuff. And then we also don't really talk about how we manage what I call this mid-transition period, where you have both the carbon-based system and the non-carbon-based system. They're both operating. They're too big to avoid constraining the other. They're both too small to actually take over all of the services that we need. And they actually are creating challenges that we probably don't see in either the beginning point or the end point, where you have one single dominant system that you can kind of optimize around. So a lot of that's pretty complicated and also has really significant implications for justice and people's safety, health, thriving capacity, all these types of things. Because as we do all of this, and as we face down climate change, you also have to keep the system actually running. So that's all really complicated, but I think it's part of the reason why it's so important to talk very explicitly about what fossil phase out looks like, and then also to talk really explicitly about what we can do that's probably robust to a bunch of different futures. And that's kind of where I'm going to take our time together today. So basic overall question is, how do you actually facilitate a just transition away from fossil fuels? And I will not answer that entire question, but I hope that many of you are already working on it as well. So to the point that I was making a moment ago, fossil fuel infrastructure will need to retire. I'm going to focus mostly for the next few minutes on the power plant sector, the electricity sector rather, so fossil-fired power plants in the United States. But this also applies to things like home heating. Again, it's snowing here and I'm relying on my still natural gas-based radiators, which is something that is actually pretty hard to change over. It also means retiring vehicles, a lot of other kinds of infrastructure, but I'm going to focus on power plants. But basically, this is kind of, and this is from the 2018 base year, so it looks a little bit different now, but this is basically the image of all of the facilities that you would expect to retire in the next relatively small number of years if we actually succeed at full decarbonization. So in particular, in the United States, there is an active policy position. It's not law, but there is a policy position that we are attempting as a country to achieve zero carbon pollution electricity by 2035. If we're successful at that, essentially all of these need to shut down in the next 12 years or so. But just to kind of give a sense of the geographies, you can also see that a lot of these facilities are pretty close to population centers, which kind of makes sense. I'm going to show a couple of charts that use pretty similar color schemes. So just to introduce you to the legend a little bit, in this image, red basically shows natural gas-fired power plants, and then the browns and blacks and grays show coal-fired power plants. There are a couple of very small green dots that are actually using oil and other petroleum fuels, but we don't really use oil for power, so you can't see them very well, but there are a few. As we think about what this transition actually is, I think one of the other big advantages of taking a very infrastructure forward view of energy transition is that we do know a lot more than we might think about what the transition is actually going to look like, because we have a lot of infrastructure that already exists and gives us an opportunity to really look into what maybe needs to happen. So with the fossil system in particular, we know where any deindustrialization is going to occur, because if you're talking about closing things that already exist, then you really have a set of existing facilities that are the ones that are essentially going to be subject to this process. And that's kind of in line with the map that I just showed. Those are the plants that we're talking about. We know a lot about how big they are. We know exactly where they are. We know how many people work there, all those kinds of things. And so we have a huge amount of information about what that process might potentially look like. We can also guess roughly when deindustrialization might occur. So thinking about this in a policy backwards perspective, if we assume that we are actually going to achieve a 2035 decarbonization target in the power sector, for example, that gives us a time interval that suggests something about what that deindustrialization process is going to look like. So we might not know, it's going to be January 1st, 2025, that this particular power generator is going to close. But we can say, if we are successful at reaching this deindustrialization goal and kind of combining that with an industrialization goal to reach zero carbon emissions in the power sector, it has to happen within this window. That actually turns out to be very powerful from a policy perspective, and I'll get at that in a minute as well. With the non-fossil system, it's kind of a little bit harder just because these are things that don't necessarily exist yet. But we do know roughly when industrialization will occur, for the same reason that we know approximately when deindustrialization will occur. In thinking about this transition, the mid-transition in particular, it's basically a zipper process where you have some stuff closing, other stuff opening, and that all has to line up basically exactly so that we can ensure that services are continued, et cetera. So we know roughly when, and then we can guess at approximately where, particularly in the power sector, where we're talking about a lot of renewable resource deployment. There are things that we know about where power plants can actually be built. There are things that we know about resource quality and things like that that allow us to make some judgments that are not just completely random about what this is actually going to look like. So I think really working backwards from policy a lot of the time and sitting and considering what information we have that is useful for making choices that are not just actually effective from a technological perspective, but are also effective and compassionate in many cases to the people that are most affected by these, is actually a really important power that we have that is helpful when we're considering just infrastructure-based processes. So again, to
Emily, so one quick interjection or question from the audience is you have we a lot and you say we a lot. So can you define what you mean by we? Is this like we, the academic community, know, or we, society, know these things? Or
generally society, I think. Is mostly how I'm using it. But yeah, occasionally in the context of like policy, when I say we, I'm generally talking about the United States as a whole.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So this is another mainly legend figure. So going back to the previous chart, this is basically showing the same thing, but I also want to introduce another aspect of this legend, which is the counties that you can see are colored in many cases with golds, grays, and reds. So again, with the dots, you have power plants, reds are gas, blacks, browns, and grays are coal, and the small green ones, the couple of green ones are mostly petroleum-based. The counties, though, are showing the labor that's associated with each of these facilities. So the golds are basically showing where you have power plant jobs, and you'll notice that most of the counties, or all of the counties that have a power plant in them, are at least some shade of gold. The darker the color, the more jobs there are in that county. The kind of pinkish colors are where natural gas production is likely serving at least some power plants. We don't really have analytically a full picture of which gas exactly goes to which plant, but it is possible to make an approximation of that. So this is basically reflecting that approximation. And then the kind of gray and darker black counties are showing coal jobs associated with feeding specific power plants. Those ones are a lot more specific because we have information about which mines are feeding which plant. And so basically what this is showing is not just the facilities, but also the labor that is supporting a lot of these power plants, to kind of make an illustration of what it looks like if we were to see these plants closing by 2035, which again is the US federal target, although not law. So that's the legend. The next image is going to actually rotate a little bit, and so I'll talk through that, but the legend is the same. So what this is showing, and I'll let it loop a couple of times, is essentially what you would expect to happen to this power infrastructure and the jobs associated with it if you assumed that generators closed at the end of a typical lifespan for the type of fuel and the type of technology that they're using. So a coal plant that is using a steam turbine versus a natural gas generator that is using a gas turbine or something like that, we can actually go back through a lot of records for US power generation and see at what age those plants tend to close. This is an outcome variable that is essentially based on a whole bunch of different inputs, but it's an empirical outcome variable. So there's not necessarily a super strong theoretical grounding for why plants tend to last exactly as long as they do. But from this empirical observational variable that takes account of things like policy, technology, just aging out, needing more maintenance, those types of things, what's actually very interesting is that it's observable that plant lifespans are pretty consistent within a specific technology and fuel class in the United States and actually even abroad. But this is something that's actually a pretty robust metric. And so what this analysis is basically doing is saying, for each generator, assume that it closes at the end of a typical lifespan. What does that actually mean for how much power we actually have still coming from fossil fuels, and then how many jobs are associated with that? What you can kind of see as this loops is that obviously some plants have already exceeded that typical lifespan. That is the nature of averages. But when you think about a 2035 target for decarbonization of the American electricity sector, a lot of our fossil-fired power generators are relatively old compared to how long they tend to last, which is about 50 years for a steam turbine, about 30 years for a gas turbine. And again, remarkably stable number in some ways, although there is some variability across fuels and specific technology types. But what this is essentially showing is that by 2035, you would expect much of this infrastructure to already be at or beyond the end of its useful life. Some plants kind of continue out, and basically the ones that have been built more recently tend to last longer. But in really looking at this, you can see that just kind of natural attrition is pretty consistent with the 2035 deadline. So roughly 73% of the fossil-fired generators that were operating as of 2018 already would have reached the end of their useful life by 2035. Turns out that the number of kind of capacity years, so considering that a plant is not brand new, if it's 20 years into a 30-year lifespan, takes that number down to about 15% of capacity years still being really expected by the time you get to 2035. So the flip side of that is essentially 85% of the investment that we have made in this large fossil system on the power side has already been used and taken advantage of by 2035. What this doesn't mean is that without any policy, without any nudges, anything like that, all of these plants would definitely close at the end of their typical normal lifespan. Again, this is averages. Some of them will close earlier, some of them will close later. Sometimes you get big investments in, say, a pollution control that extends their lifespan, et cetera. But it does mean that a lot of the concern that people occasionally have about fossil phase out is that is associated with a concern about stranded assets is not necessarily that significant, at least in the United States. We have relatively old infrastructure. There are a lot of very interesting reasons for that, many of which are policy driven, and we can talk about that in the Q&A if people are curious. But I think the overall point is it's actually not as disruptive as it seems like it might be to do things like setting some of these deadlines and having plants retire consistent with our climate goals. This is not an infrastructure that lasts forever, and it actually does give us a lot of really important opportunities to anticipate closures and then really start to make choices about how we're going to facilitate that, preferably with some advance warning. I see a question about oil extraction and whether those jobs are not affected. Basically, we don't account for that because there are so few megawatt hours that are generated from oil. So changes to oil demand from transportation or something like that would have a big impact on oil extraction jobs, but there's essentially no oil extraction that is dedicated specifically to the power sector the way that there is for coal and gas. So we didn't think that it was a strong enough link to make a claim about oil labor associated with plant closures. But thank you, good question. But yeah, so overall point being, we actually have a massive opportunity to take advantage of some infrastructure starting to age out as we think about how we're going to replace it in this decarbonized sense. Sorry. What that means is that there are some infrastructural systems that will disappear, potentially with pretty big local implications, and some of those are positive and some of them are negative. This is basically a bar chart showing the same thing that that rotating map was showing, but when you would expect without intervention, plants to actually close is also correlated with changes to not only their generation, so their intended output, but also water consumption, employment, CO2 emissions, SO2 emissions, and NOx emissions. As plants close, you do actually get a lot of benefits in pollution phasing out, but you also lose some jobs. This also kind of goes for things like taxes. We actually did an analysis that I'm not going to get into a bunch of detail on today that looked at the extent to which power plants are actually contributing locally meaningful property taxes, and it's a lot lower than you would expect. Many of them do get pretty significant exemptions, and so that's less of an issue, but it can be locally significant. But indeed, it does mean that a lot of the systems that are phasing out will go away, and that can be pretty important for places. Part of the real idea behind talking about a just transition, which is something that really originated around people being concerned about labor being phased out associated with atomic energy and chemical workers, once we started to really see environmental laws picking up in the United States, is really asking, if we are phasing out these industries in service of a greater societal goal, what do we do with the people that have spent their lives working in them and all of that sort of stuff? The meaning of just transition has expanded a bit since then, but this kind of labor first origination is actually a really important one as we think about what this looks like. I think one of the other big points about just looking at labor in particular is you actually do need people working in these industries up until you no longer need the facilities to be running anymore. And so figuring out a way that you're not just creating potentially massive implications for the people that work in those plants, but also for their host communities in a way that allows you to kind of fill in some of the needs there, make sure that people have what they need to continue to thrive, even as we're seeing these closures happen, is a lot of the impetus for thinking about phase out from an advanced perspective in the policy space. One of the other kind of important things about this, though, is that as you could probably see from my maps, some assets do likely last beyond 2035. And this is also something that we see in other fossil industry sectors. So looking particularly at like transportation industry, heating, those types of things. With power, stranded assets based on where they are and kind of an analysis that we're able to do looking at those locations and host community characteristics could likely disproportionately affect more impoverished people, which is something that is potentially a target for policy intervention. So just looking at potentially stranded existing utility assets, and in this case, what I mean by stranded is a plant that is required to shut down before it reaches the end of its useful life. The megawatt capacity for those assets is actually correlated with the percentage of people living in poverty in these states. It's not a super strong correlation, but it does exist. Similarly, for proposed utility assets, which weren't part of this analysis directly, but basically places where utilities are saying we're going to build new fossil infrastructure, that's also pretty, not super strongly, but noticeably correlated with the percentage of people in poverty. So thinking about who pays for these types of things and exactly who is harmed by transition is another really big need that we see as we think about justice in doing this. Let me take a second to read this question real quick, and then I will answer it. But yeah, so to summarize the question really quickly, basically, we see situations where power plant owners are closing plants and then somebody, ERCOT or a PUCT or somebody is telling them to open back up for reliability. That is something that I've observed in a couple places that aren't just Texas, and it's a really interesting side effect of the way that we do governance in this space, I think. I don't think that it's just ERCOT and just like energy market stuff or whatever. I think California is another example where this has happened a couple times, although maybe not exactly after the fact, but basically a couple of gas plants had sort of won negotiations to close, largely because they were on beaches and people wanted the pollution to stop, all this kind of thing. And they were essentially asked to stay online and had their retirement date extended a couple times for reliability reasons. I think one of the reasons why it's important to look at how we're closing things and how we're opening things from a much more centralized perspective. So this is a good segue into what I was going to talk about in a second too, is basically that you do need somebody in a coordinating role there. As long as you have a lot of privately owned assets that are essentially making asset by asset decisions that are often based on profitability, you're going to end up with uncoordination that may have a lot of potential to collapse all at once. This is an interesting one to talk about in the power plant context, but I think it's actually potentially more interesting to talk about, and by more interesting, I mean more terrifying, but potentially more salient in a couple of other spaces. So in particular, the transportation sector is quite a bit less regulated in terms of a positive obligation to serve, having a utility, actually providing people with fuels, those types of things. It's a lot more privatized. And so you can imagine a situation where you get enough EV uptake or something else that suddenly gas stations aren't actually profitable anymore. And if that happens to one of them, it's probably happening to many at once. And there are versions of the world where you could see a bunch of gas stations kind of simultaneously realizing that they're no longer profitable and all going away at the same time, when you still have 40, 50% ICE vehicle penetration or something like that. Right now, there is no governing mechanism that says that that can't happen. There's a little bit more of it in the power sector, but there's a lot of this kind of thing where the individual asset decisions that people are making, that they are allowed to make and that are reasonable to make, may not be that well aligned with the kinds of continuity of service decisions that we need to make. But yeah, I don't think that's just a Texas thing, and I don't think it's just a power thing either. And yeah, the impact of change of political party and what that means for goals and timing, it's probably expected that if political control in Washington changes, we will not have as explicit of climate goals. That said, all we have right now are policy targets and not necessarily a whole lot of effort to make those binding anyway. So I think this needs to go beyond a political party shift. It's not just about that. It's really about how we think about who's managing this transition and whether we need a central management, which I would argue that we do. But yeah, political party matters, certainly, quite a bit. Like, it's better to have a climate goal than not have a climate goal, and I'm willing to make that normative statement, but we actually need to do more than have a goal at some point as well. But yeah, thank you for the questions. I'm actually going to skip the next couple of these because I see a lot of questions and I want to make sure that we can talk about them. But the overall point basically is that there's a lot of cultural investment and a lot of cultural feelings about fossil fuels in ways that go well beyond these just as technologies. And it tends to be people feel relatively positive about oil and relatively negative about coal. And this kind of influences a lot of the way that we see those resources being managed and in policy contexts and things like this. So we can get more into this later if that's useful, but I'm going to skip over these quickly and just say, and kind of echoing these last couple of questions, that planning ahead and actually ensuring that a lot of this is coordinated is really, really important if we're actually going to achieve a just transition, both in the context of ensuring that people that are working in these industries have a way to transition both with dignity, but also with material welfare and all those types of things, but also for host communities and for the rest of us that are also affected by transition. This is a picture from an old iron furnace. It's actually not a steel mill. This is an iron mill that was shut down, I believe, in the 70s. But one of the things that I think is actually a real touch point for me in thinking about a lot of these transitions is that we have seen what happens when unplanned transitions have occurred in the past, and it's typically not very good. So I get the question a lot, like, well, what are the great examples? Where have we really managed to do a full-scale industrial transition very well? There aren't a ton of them, frankly, but what we can learn from a lot of the transitions that we have seen happen that haven't gone that well is actually really instructive and kind of comes back to a couple of major themes. So essentially, in the United States, the iron and steel industry basically collapsed over a decade or so in the 70s and 80s. Again, I live in Indiana now. The impact of that process is still quite visible around here. Like, people will refer more overall in the country to the Rust Belt, things like that. I think this is a familiar story to a lot of people, but essentially an industry collapsed pretty rapidly without a lot of planning, without a lot of coordination, and a lot of people were pretty seriously harmed, and a lot of host communities were pretty seriously harmed. Many times it was in the context of, people would go to work one day and basically hear that the mill was closed, they were out of a job, and there was really nothing that was available and no advanced planning. When you look at contemporaneous documents from that collapse, and this is also true in a couple of other contexts, so some of the coal industry collapse that we've seen over the last decade or so, a bit in the textile collapse that's a bit older, although that was a very female-dominated industry, so there's fewer accounts of it. But what we do tend to see in contemporaneous documents is that people were very interested in calling for more advanced notice. So, it's okay if this is going to close, but if you'd given me 6 months to know that would have helped me square my work away, start looking for another job, figure out what I was going to do with my mortgage, that sort of thing. At the high end, like, people were really trying to figure out any advance notice. And we do now have some laws that say that you need to give people at least a couple months heads up if you're going to lay a bunch of folks off. Doesn't always happen, but that is actually in place now. But there were also calls of saying, if we had 2 years before this happened, we could figure out what to do with the site and figure out how not to let it just sort of become this site of industrial blight. Think about what else we could do with these facilities, et cetera. And now that we're starting to see a pretty significant transition in the power sector, there's a lot of evidence that that kind of advanced planning could also be extraordinarily useful in this context. I think one of the key points that I want to make to kind of tie this in with what I was just showing in terms of plant age is basically that 2035 is very quick. That's a really, really rapid transition. And if we decided as a country that 2035 actually was the deadline for reaching zero emissions and took that seriously, moved it beyond just a goal, that gives us 12 years of advance notice to really talk about this and figure out what is going to happen in each of these host communities in a way that probably is long enough to really make some progress. And there's quite a bit of research evidence that suggests that having those deliberative processes and really being able to engage can improve outcomes quite significantly. That also means that you have a lot more certainty about what other kinds of things you need to be able to do. So you can't just close a bunch of stuff down without having a replacement. If you know exactly not only where something is going to close, which again, we already do because they're existing facilities, but you also know when they're going to close, that gives you a lot more ability to think about what the transition is, not just for the infrastructure, but also for what the replacement infrastructure needs to be able to do. That's not something that is easy necessarily, but some sort of coordination that actually allows you to take account of this kind of simultaneous opening and closure is pretty important. And we see quite a lot of evidence from a bunch of different contexts that this would actually be pretty helpful. So before I move into the next kind of topic of this talk, let me answer a couple of questions. So I see, wouldn't synthetic fuels extend the life of utility assets? For power plants, probably not. I don't think people are really talking about making synthetic coal, stuff like that. It may be relevant for vehicles more, is kind of where I see it with synthetic hydrocarbons, but I haven't seen a ton of talk about synthetic fuels for power plants. Some power to gas stuff as grid support, so either hydrogen or atmospherically derived CO2 made into methane potentially, but those both have some challenges as well. Particularly power to gas in the methane sense is challenging because you're creating a greenhouse gas, and so if you have any leakage, you need to be pretty conscious of that. So maybe I think the concern that I have more than synthetic fuels for extending the lifespan of power plants is installing carbon capture on very old facilities. Those are usually kind of billion-dollar investments or so. And so if you do install carbon capture, you're very likely extending the lifespan of whatever you put it on. Yeah, we can talk about that in the Q&A also a little bit. I spent a couple of years working for the Department of Energy on carbon management issues, and this is something that I think is actually a fairly serious risk. Next question that I see is, how do regulations in the free market influence the dynamics of this transition, and what are some technologies that can facilitate a smoother progression? Quite honestly, I'm sure there are some technologies that can facilitate a smoother progression, but my broader concern is more around governance and institutions than technologies at this point. I think particularly with power, it's funny, like we talk about the possibility of miracle technologies that are zero carbon and really cheap, and then also kind of look over and see that solar is, an order of magnitude cheaper than it was a decade or so ago, and some of the cheapest power that you can build right now. Similarly with wind, although on a slightly different trajectory. Like, we have a lot of the technologies that we actually need to make this happen. And to my mind, it's a lot more about the regulations, the form of the market, that type of thing, than it is about technologies. But yeah, I think that in a fully marketized context, where there is no central coordinating role and there aren't a lot of regulations about exactly how this goes, is both a real threat to achieving climate goals, which again are not mandated, but then are also not necessarily conscious of a lot of the service interruption problems that we might have. So I see an uncoordinated transition essentially as a pretty significant safety issue. If you're not paying attention to exactly what facility is fulfilling which specific service, and you don't have somebody kind of watching that, I think this is probably something that's maybe tenderly close to home for a lot of Texans that lived through a lot of the Uri experience. Like, if you do not have somebody coordinating which services is actually supplying the things that you need, you can run into trouble really, really quickly. And I think that that's maybe one of the best arguments for coordination here. Thank you for the question. And then with energy demand increasing dramatically every year, how do I propose we replace fossil fuels and expand energy production to meet demand? That's interesting. In the US, I think energy demand is not increasing dramatically every year. We've been around 100 quads of primary energy for quite a while, actually. And I think it's actually even gone down a little bit in recent years. It's a bit of a COVID bump, but even without that, it's not necessarily increasing that dramatically. What we do see is potentially in a lot of deep decarbonization modeling, a real shift from fossil primary energy to services being managed by electricity instead. That may actually decrease the total amount of primary energy that we're using depending on what resources go into that, but it does mean a really, really significant expansion of the electricity grid. So that is, I think, a bigger issue. And indeed, we need to build things a lot faster, even as we retire a lot of things. But yeah, fundamentally, replacing 80% of our industrial energy system is not that easy. It's something we need to do if we care about climate change and a lot of these other things, but it's not an easy one to do. Thank you for the question. And then next one, what are my personnel mobility assumptions? How many people will move to new locations versus the number that stay locally and move into new jobs? And how do they vary by worker age? That's a really interesting question. And yeah, it's something that I haven't spent a ton of time doing in a super formal way. But one thing that I've actually been wanting to work on for quite a while is really looking at differences across various fossil industries, but also other industries in terms of personnel mobility. So I grew up in an oil and gas family, and we moved every few years, basically. And a lot of people that I knew were in pretty similar situations. People that work in the coal industry tend to stay in place, and it has a lot to do with the longevity of an individual production asset, that kind of thing. Like, one coal mine might last for 50 years. One oil well doesn't need the same person to necessarily stay there all the time. And so there are very different cultural expectations within these industries about how willing people are to move. So yeah, we didn't look at that in a super dramatic way, but although I do have some other work that looks at climate-induced mobility, not just from a worker perspective. But yeah, that's a good question. And I think this point about worker age is also a really interesting one. Not talking about it as much in this particular talk, but one of the things that I do worry about a lot is that if we're thinking about this transition taking several decades, you actually do need your A-team operating high hazard industry assets, especially within the fossil industry, until the very last day and probably a bit beyond that those assets are actually operating. That's not an easy thing to do when you're also simultaneously saying this industry is going away. And I think is another huge, huge opportunity for really thinking about this from a much more coordinated and centralized perspective. But yeah, worker mobility is another one of the reasons that I actually will also advocate that things like universal health care and a lot of social safety nets are actually fairly critical for a successful energy transition, because when you have people depending on their jobs for a lot of this, and you can't depend on a job actually being stable enough for you, you end up in some very tricky places very quickly. Thank you. All right, next one. I see mid-transition is a useful paradigm for understanding the struggle of ISOs to find a market design. Any insights into how to manage that transition and manage the pace of fossil fuel retirements in the context of electricity market design? That's a really interesting one, and one that I haven't necessarily done a ton of very specific work on, like with individual ISOs. But I do think in general that there is a real opportunity for being very, very explicit about timing. And I know I get a little stuck on this sometimes, but just thinking about what can you do if you have certainty about location and timing is actually so much more significant than if you're just kind of assuming that a market force is going to cause something, or that a company might just make a decision at any given time. And I think a lot of the time, the ISOs probably don't have super strong authority to necessarily mandate those types of things, but where they have the opportunity to really consider within a lot of their planning what would happen under a bunch of these different conditions, and where they really can work with the states and other people to figure that out, I think would be helpful. But yeah, this is one of those spaces where I hope that there are a lot of people thinking deeply about that. I have not, but it's a huge deal for sure. Cool. So thank you for the questions. All right, so I'm going to jump a little bit topically, because I think a lot of the time when we think about, again, just transition historically was really grounded in what happens to the workforce when basically a society makes a decision that a specific industry needs to be phased out for greater societal good. That's a really important thing. And again, I do think that there is a very strong argument to be made that we need to focus pretty significantly on the fossil workforce, if only because this is a set of infrastructures that are pretty dangerous if you don't have people that know what they're doing handling them. That goes double for when you're actually also dealing with both climate change and big technology dynamism, because you're suddenly working in a context where it's not just a fossil system and there's a bunch of other things you need to manage. But when we think about broader notions of justice and what that looks like, one of the things that often is kind of uncomfortably pointed out is that a lot of the policy that we have that's very, very much focused on workforces is really ending up emphasizing a pretty small number of people that are pretty well off. Like, these are generally pretty high paying industries and are whiter than average. And so really having a lot of attention to what happens to the population of people that have already kind of benefited from this, and again, do need supports, but not focusing on the people that are affected by climate change itself, by a lot of these other issues, is kind of problematic in a lot of ways. One of the reasons that I tend to advocate for universal policies, but I think this is also a reason to really think carefully about what it means to transition in ways that are kind of promoting general human welfare, thriving, and safety. So with that, and kind of to emphasize a little bit of what I've said already, a lot of the challenges with the transition are justice in general, like who's affected, who is involved, like how do we make sure that everybody has a world that they can thrive in, all during this transition and then also beyond. Then also thinking about coordinating supply and demand and coordinating that phase out with phase in. These are all really difficult problems, and I think they're solvable in many cases, but we don't necessarily spend enough time talking about them. So in a very particular context, and again, to shift gears a little bit just to talk about something that I think is an important piece of modeling. So thinking about deindustrialization, I think, gets left out of models a lot, but also the demand side gets left out of models a lot. Building efficiency is a pretty significant climate and resilience strategy, and this is particularly true for homes. And kind of as a side note, when we think about what, not as a side note, but when we think about what it actually means to undertake this transition, which probably means a lot of electrification and shifting end users to using electricity that's generated via renewables and other zero carbon fuels, really thinking about that demand side and really thinking carefully about building efficiency has potentially really, really large grid size benefits, mostly associated with reducing peak loads. So in buildings, we tend to see the electricity consumption for air conditioning and cooling specifically being the driver of peak loads at this point. As you start to electrify end uses, including home heating, that's part of why we're starting to expect winter peaks in a lot of situations. But essentially, when you're talking about heating and cooling, you're talking about non-deferrable coincident loads that are maybe going to last for quite a while. So if one person in an area needs cooling, probably everybody else does too. If one person needs heating, probably everybody else does too. And it turns out heating is actually, in many parts of the country, even places that aren't that cold, possibly a bigger issue than cooling, largely because what we're capable of reaching on the cold side is so much further off of comfortable and safe temperatures than what we're capable of reaching on the hot side. Heat waves are still at this point more dangerous, but there is a really big difference between heating from 20 degrees to 60 degrees versus cooling from 100 degrees to 80 degrees or something like that, just in terms of safety and the total amount of energy you're talking about. So as we think about transition, as we think about what it actually is that's being coordinated, and as we think about what else we could do that isn't just kind of a one-for-one replacement of everything that's going on, really being very conscious of some of these dynamics and looking for opportunities to make interventions that are more protective of people and are more robust to different climate futures, I think is a really important element of how we think about transition. So I've alluded to this a couple of times. This is one particular study. There's also a kind of harmonizing study through the EMF 37 that looks at a number of different models to think about what electricity generation capacity might be at a net zero future. This is the Net Zero America study out of Princeton, suggesting that by 2050, in net zero scenarios, you're maybe going from about a little over 1 terawatt of installed capacity on the electricity grid to somewhere between 2.5 and 6.5. The EMF 37 results suggest, I think, kind of a 5 to 8 terawatt range on the high end, depending on which model you're looking at. But the overall point is, especially on the electricity side, even though we're probably reducing primary energy use, the electricity sector itself and the electricity infrastructure actually probably needs to grow by multiple X. So potentially almost an order of magnitude, depending on what you assume about things like hydrogen and direct air capture, which are less included in some of these models. Similarly with syn fuels, potentially another big user. But overall point is we actually do need to build a massive, massive amount of electricity capacity, both because we're shifting a lot of energy demand to electricity, but also because accommodating those peak loads is actually pretty hard. And you need a lot of infrastructure, particularly when you're in a situation where you're using variable renewables, to have enough redundancy to actually manage it. So huge, huge amount of infrastructure, which always kind of begs the question, is there something else we could do here? So this is a case study. The next couple of slides, I'm going to talk about some results from a case study that we did of electrification in a very cold weather place, and basically looking at what the impact of really significant building efficiency interventions would be on peak loads. This was led by my student, Alex Maxim, who is now a consultant up in Canada working on this kind of stuff, and did a lot of work on climate-induced mobility as well. Chose Pierre essentially because there was a record all-time low in a data set that we were using that was correlated with basically temperature and load from individual houses, and also because it's a community where under climate change, we might expect some fairly significant population growth based on some modeling that EPA and others have done. Like I mentioned a minute ago, winter peaks are particularly difficult to meet and also particularly dangerous if something goes wrong. And this is basically because winter peaks are actually correlated with heating. You need to fulfill those loads somehow. Maybe that means bringing everybody to a more centralized heating location, something else, but you do actually need to make sure that people have that service. Winter peaks are also especially difficult to meet because they occur in the winter, which means that you probably have a lot less access to solar. In some places, maybe a bit less access to wind than you might be expecting. That varies a little bit, but this is a real challenge for grids. And so it's something where really thinking about whether there are alternatives and things that could make this a bit easier to manage is pretty valuable potentially. So this is a lot of details, but just to kind of put up the proof that we actually looked at it, we investigated 7 different scenarios for improving the efficiency of buildings. 3 were looking at non-electrified housing, so basically just efficiency, but assuming that there was still some direct fossil fuel use. And then 4 of them were looking at full electrification, which is kind of widely understood to be a really important lever for achieving full decarbonization. And the punchline here is essentially that what we found was when you compare the cost of interventions for efficiency, particularly under the electrification cases, to the cost of new power generation capacity that is able to meet something like a winter peak, this is actually potentially cost effective and also is something that provides a lot more robustness and resilience to houses and therefore provides a lot of safety to their occupants. So kind of a combination mitigation and adaptation measure that, again, is maybe cost effective compared to a supply side intervention, but also creates kind of a really much more significant impact on people's safety. Houses that are more efficient can ride through temperatures for longer. They don't need as much external heating, those kinds of things. And so we were really looking at opportunities for deep efficiency to not just reduce the amount of grid infrastructure you need to build, but also provide a lot of benefits that I hesitate to even call co-benefits because they're probably more important than the grid reduction capacity. Basically, making it so that people can be safe in their homes during very cold interventions. And basically what this was that we took 15-minute interval data for projected load by individual houses under these different efficiency scenarios, and basically said, okay, under this extreme cold situation, how does the load vary when you consider the different efficiency interventions? And then can we calculate how much you would have had to pay for something like that relative to what you would have had to do to install additional capacity? I know these are probably a little small on your screens, but basically what this shows is that in an electrification scenario, which again is probably prerequisite for full decarbonization in the residential sector, really investing in efficiency, not just in appliances, but also the envelope of the house, could potentially cut peak loads by about half on extreme days. We chose the extreme cold day because we assumed that that's a good approximation of overall peak, because we also assume that in a cold place, the winter peak is going to be more significant than the summer peak. But basically, because the overall annual peak is the one that dictates how big the electricity system needs to be, identifying the situation where really investing in efficiency is good for people, probably good for health because you have less combustion inside, those kinds of things, et cetera, has a bunch of other impacts, actually also cuts your peak load needs by about half. This is something that we just did in this particular case study, but there have been other studies that have looked on slightly broader scales, maybe with a little bit less resolution, that have come up with very similar outcomes. So overall point being, deep building efficiency is a potentially really, really important aspect of a just transition that focuses on decarbonization, but also trying to keep people safe through all of this and through climate change and a lot of the uncertainties associated with it. So yeah, this is just another image of that, basically showing that even with a situation where you're moving from a non-electrified baseline to a fully electrified baseline, you don't necessarily increase your peak loads by that much if you coincide electrification with full efficiency. And then relative to low efficiency electrification, you're probably cutting your peak loads by half by really investing in this. And yeah, basically the costs for these high efficiency interventions per kilowatt of peak reduction are pretty similar to supply side interventions that are actually capable of delivering in those winter peak situations. This is just a couple of technologies chosen from the ATB. I think I would love to see numbers for like hydrogen backup, but ATB doesn't have those yet, so we will wait on them. But just illustratively, this is not kind of a definitive thing, but as an exploratory study, we were quite interested to see that you not only get this really big benefit from not having to build stuff, but it might actually even be cheaper potentially. So with that, I hope we have a little bit of time for questions, but my overall point is we can do transition in a lot of ways, but there are big opportunities to do a good job, and there are a lot of very urgent things that bear some working on. So again, thank you for spending part of your afternoon with me and for hosting me today.
All right, thank you, Emily. Well, you did a good job of answering questions as they came up. There is one here on YouTube that's not exactly what you talked about, but sort of fits your background, and I don't know if you have any insight into it, but essentially, do you have any insights or have you done any calculations on sort of the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions of the transition when you account for upstream greenhouse gas emissions of building out the new low carbon electricity system, batteries and wind and solar and all that kind of thing? Do you have any insights on that?
Yeah, so great question. I haven't done that calculation myself, but I know a number of people have. I think the most recent kind of global paper that I saw maybe came out 6 months ago or so, but most of the people that have done that calculation conclude essentially that, yeah, it's a pretty big number, but it pays back extraordinarily quickly, and it's something that you have to do at some point anyway. If you're going to fully transition, it's hard to avoid using what we have in order to do that, and it does pay back very quickly.
Right. You did mention at least a little bit about carbon capture and not wanting to put a shiny new carbon capture facility on an old power plant, but how do we think, or how have you thought about keeping, let's just say, for example, a lot of natural gas infrastructure around power plants, even if they have really low capacity factors, as a kind of backup plan of thinking, well, we can turn these things on, and if they operate 1, 2, 3% of the hours of the year, well, then maybe we like that and we didn't quite get to net zero, but we're really close.
I love that you asked that question. This is one of my favorite rants, actually. I think it's reasonable from a modeling perspective to try to look at what those kinds of very, very low penetrations would look like. The big concern that I have as a very physical infrastructure oriented person is that I don't think a lot of models that look at the cost effectiveness of that relative to something like a hydrogen backup or a bunch of other chemical fuel carriers that don't necessarily need networked infrastructure is how you get the gas and how you ensure that the gas is actually there when you need it. I think there's a lot that goes into conversations about when you might use these very low capacity factor gas backups, but really acknowledging that when you would be calling on those gas backups are the most difficult hours of the year for a system that is now operating well below the capacities that it was expected to be operating at. And you have a huge amount of support infrastructure that's maybe not really available anymore. I'm not necessarily convinced that we maintain a pipeline infrastructure that has the necessary minimum pipeline pressures and things like that, that is actually capable of delivering under these extraordinarily difficult conditions at the kinds of prices that people use to get those results into deep decarb models. And I think maybe the overall point is, I haven't done these numbers necessarily, but when people talk about not being able to use hydrogen instead, or not being able to use like even a syn fuel instead for those few hours a year, I'm not sure that we're talking about kind of a $3,000 a megawatt hour problem at those hours. We might be talking more like a $50,000 or $100,000 a megawatt hour option there. And when you account for the actual maintenance of all of that infrastructure that keeps gas coming, and having extraction still, having those pipelines still, et cetera, I think it's not as cost effective as it looks in a lot of models. Is kind of my take there.
Right, good point. We certainly wonder here in Texas about the natural gas delivery in an extreme winter event. As you noted, that's kind of the hardest time to meet the electrification load. There's a couple more questions just on the Q&A. I don't know if you want to read those and think about them yourself versus me.
Yeah, I will take Michael's point, and I appreciate the softball that we allow central planning in other contexts, but not in energy. Like, agree. I think we do need central planning, and I'm getting more comfortable with saying that more explicitly. But yeah, like, I honestly think we probably need some sort of transition management agency if we're going to do this well. But the kinds of governance structures that we have right now are not going to solve a lot of these problems. And in the US, our policy affect right now has tended to be very focused on subsidies of things that we like and dis-subsidies or taxes of things that we don't like. That abdicates a really important coordinating function and a really important management function that I think still needs to be served. Because this is not a situation where if you have a couple of plants closed down, it's kind of no big deal. It's a situation where suddenly people can't get to work, can't heat their houses, those types of things. And there probably is more of a function for a central planner here than we're willing to talk about a lot of the time.
Yeah. Just for the listeners, I point out that the reference to central planning was the Department of Transportation.
Thank you. And then the other one, I see thoughts on US energy security and maintaining a baseline of fossil capacity. I'm an advocate for phase out, and I think we need to do that safely, but I don't think we necessarily need to maintain a baseline. There are certain applications that probably still use fossil-derived hydrocarbons for a while, but those are very, very, very high-value ones, and I think that there's a lot of space to think about how we provide some of those services without necessarily maintaining a lot of the more bulk power and bulk energy kinds of pieces of it. But yeah, nice thing about renewables is that they're local a lot of the time. So,
right. Well, they're local when we put them on the ground, and we're having lots more discussions about how local they are when we make them or get them, and that's a big part of at least the Inflation Reduction Act and all this kind of justice, who's got a job, and all this kind of thing that you've been looking at. So, Emily Gruber, professor of
thank you.
Energy Policy, Energy Sustainability Policy, and Civil and Environmental Engineering at Notre Dame. Thanks for joining us today with the UT Energy Symposium.
Thank you all. Happy Halloween.
Happy